Dr. Harper, for succinctly setting everything up. So this thesis topic is obviously very rather far-fetched in that it combines two distinct areas of study, one being a sport and the other being an event from a historical era. But for me, it was a perfect match because European football has always been my favorite sport, and medieval history is one of my favorite historical eras to study. And so the way this presentation will work is, as Dr. Harper mentioned, I will go through my main points of my argument and discuss my findings, and then once everything is concluded, I will leave the floor open for questions from the audience and have a Q&A session for about 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and as much time as necessary. So with that, let's get started. So my research approach for this honors thesis was that I needed to see if there was any sort of influence on this rivalry from the Wars of the Roses, and if so, I needed to deduce what that influence took shape as, and also I needed to consider any other possible influences, because with the Premier League, the English League, it has not stayed the same throughout its history, especially from the 1990s onward, and so the league landscape has evolved in a broad sense, and so I wanted to see if any of these evolutions that came from the globalization of the league affected this rivalry in either a broad sense or on a ground level. And to illustrate those thoughts, I presented a few questions. I needed to find out why especially the rose symbols were important for the historical narrative, and then to see, again, to say if this rivalry has an influence from the Wars of the Roses. Is that a modern misconception or not? That was a crucial question to have to answer. And then finally, as I said, the globalization, which definitely changed the league itself, did it have any effect on this rivalry? And so now I will start analyzing my main points of my argument, with the first one being, where do these rivalries overlap, medieval and modern rivalries? Now, an important fact to note is that Manchester United and Leeds United, they identify with their counties, those being Lancashire and Yorkshire, rather than their cities, which is very uncommon in English football rivalry because generally clubs, they contest a shared geographical space to see which club is more superior in that space. But these two clubs identifying with counties which have influence from historical developments, and specifically the royal houses Lancaster and York, which fought the Wars of the Roses. This gives the rivalry a different nuance that other rivalries don't really have in English football. And to illustrate this sequencing of influence, I've put together a very simple diagram, which it's messed up now because it's on Google presentation. It looked better on my PowerPoint, so I apologize for that. But I would also like to know that this diagram is just meant to be very simple. It's not all-encompassing. It's just meant to generate an understanding going forward. So then, once I illustrate the more social nuances of this rivalry, we can call back to how this diagram thus changes. It isn't fixed like this, but it does start with the royal houses that fought in the war, and then moves on to symbolism, which I will discuss more in more depth in the next slide, and then into the counties themselves, and finally to the football clubs and how they've engaged with the previous points of this diagram. And then the next important point to consider is historical tribalism, which was exhibited before and during the Wars of the Roses. So during the 15th century, many English citizens felt a greater allegiance to the counties or shires they lived in rather than the broader overall nation and the monarchy. And so when the war came about, the supporters of the two royal houses, they were fiercely loyal to their cause because the war took a feeling more of a foreign conflict rather than a traditional civil war, which was a really interesting find. And so this plays out in that it has a different feel to it, which then cemented this tribalism, which didn't go away as England evolved, and it will soon find its way into this rivalry more specifically. And now for my personal favorite slide of my presentation. seeing how these two clubs engage with these rose symbols, those being the white rose of Yorkshire and the red rose of Lancashire. And an important point to note is that originally these two symbols were just a part of many heraldic badges and symbols used by these two royal houses, but the event that cemented them as the main narrative symbol for the war and also the crucial main symbol for these two counties were the actions of the ruling House of Tudor, which concluded the war by uniting the two royal houses, and they did it through the Tudor badge, as you see in the bottom left-hand corner. And what's important about this badge is that it's meant to show, for the purposes of royal propaganda, as I've noted, the Tudor house is ascended to the throne when England was just embroiled in so much bloodshed, so much anarchy and violence, and that showing the houses are united again and two colors of the same rose, if you will. It's meant to show that the Tudor house is the rightful ruling body to lead England to a greater era of peace and prosperity and away of all this previous fighting and bloodshed. And with the clubs, they have engaged with the roses at different points, and it is the time difference is important, and I will expand upon that very soon in the next point. Leeds United, they've used the white rose in their logos and imagery much more recently than Manchester United have. They used that red rose badge in a very unique and beautiful jersey used in the 1909 domestic cup final. But as time goes on, Manchester United grew more and more distant from this local symbolism, while Leeds still uses it. And finally, all of these points lead to the idea that all of these previous influences, they are present in this rivalry, which shows that the Wars of the Roses does have a legitimate influence. But now we'll see that it's not the only influence. There are other nuances and complexities at work here. So, as I just noted, Manchester United, they've begun to grow more distant from this local symbolism. This is the case because my next point, local identity against global brand, it illustrates how these two clubs have begun to separate alongside the evolution of the English Premier League. And they both brilliantly represent a trend where large and wealthy clubs, they've benefited from the globalization by being able to have more means and more invitations to expand their brands and try to bring a lot more fan bases abroad and making their brand much more distinguishable for people outside of England. Meanwhile, smaller and less successful clubs, they didn't have the opportunities to benefit from these means that the other clubs were given because they had the names, they had the financial means to be able to sell the Premier League abroad. Smaller clubs couldn't do that, and so they remained intimately tied to their local communities and identities because that's mostly all they had. Again, they can't benefit from these same advantages the other clubs began to gain. And so what I would like to illustrate is that before the Premier League's inception in 1992, most English clubs had a set belief on how a club should act with its supporters. It should be a two-way relationship where a football club is meant to be this avenue for the supporters to showcase their support and being able to identify with the club that is in the locality that they live in. And at the same time, clubs, they can feed off of this support to try to go for greater and more meaningful successes with their fans behind them. And it's illustrated in this quote from a former football chairman, Thesis. And what I'd like to point your attention to is remembering roots. That is the base of this traditional view, is really staying connected with the place that you were formed in and around, and the people that are in the place where you were founded in. However, as the Premier League globalizes, the top clubs that became more and more global focused, they were not as tied down to their roots as before, and so soon local supporters just became grouped together with foreign fans all in the same. because these global football clubs, all they really started to care about is how to generate more revenue, more club exposure, and to be able to gain the means to be among the most popular football clubs in the world. And so that brings to the next quote I would like to illustrate, in that there was a greater tension between clubs and local supporters who felt that this sport was meant for them, in that it was supposed to be intimately connected to how they identify themselves in relation to these clubs. And so with clubs being more and more global focused, the clubs at the top of the league, they started to feel betrayed and in a weird spot, in that they felt that they were beginning to lose a very critical social enterprise.